One of the hardest realizations in adulthood is discovering that what felt normal as a child actually wasn't. There are many versions of family dysfunction that don't actually look like abuse. They don't always have bruises, there aren't always screaming fights, and sometimes from the outside, it looks very normal. But inside the family system, there are behaviors that are getting quietly normalized. Things that cause harm, things that create confusion, and things that teach children that unhealthy dynamics are just the way life works. And when you grow up inside that environment, you often don't recognize it as dysfunctional at all. It just feels normal. And so today I want to talk about the quiet ways that families normalize harm and why, frankly, it can take years or even decades to really see those patterns clearly. Psychologists who study family dynamics often talk about something called the family systems theory. And the basic idea is that you can't really understand a person without understanding the family dynamics that they grew up in. Families, as you all know, develop patterns. You have roles, you have rules, you have emotional habits, and many of these patterns get passed down generation to generation. So if harmful behavior is part of that system, children grow up believing that that behavior is normal, not because they're naive, but because that's the environment that their brains adapted to. When you grow up in a dysfunctional environment, your internal sense of what's normal can get distorted. Some therapists describe this as having a broken normal meter. So if chaos, manipulation, secrecy, and control are part of your everyday life growing up, those things start to feel normal. And when you encounter those dynamics later in life, they are not going to automatically feel like red flags. They just feel familiar. And that familiarity and comfort is often one of the many reasons that these patterns can find themselves repeating generation after generation. One of the most common rules in dysfunctional families is something therapists can summarize as don't talk, don't trust, and don't feel. It's basically an unspoken rule that problems inside the family stay inside the family. And when children learn that rule early on, they grow up believing that silence is safer than honesty. That concept showed up heavily in my family. If my mother talked to her siblings or parents about something in our family, particularly if it related to my father, she would get shut down immediately. I remember once she was talking to, I think it was her mother, about financial problems after my father had been laid off. And he basically interrupted the conversation saying something along the lines of, "Why are you telling her our family business? This is none of her business." Now, arguably, my grandmother is part of the family, but oh no, that is not what he meant. And that might sound silly and small, but the message was very clear. We do not talk about what happens in this house to anyone. This rule applied to anything sensitive within our family, but especially things like my father's bipolar manic episodes or our financial issues or his behavior. But interestingly enough, if the topic wasn't about him, he didn't really seem to care if it was about us or whatever. But there's another layer, is that on top of that, both of my parents were very heavily invested in what I call the white picket fence family illusion. From the outside, we were supposed to always look like the perfect family, and what happened inside that house was never supposed to threaten that illusion. Another common dynamic within the family is something psychologists often call a loyalty bind. So this is when loyalty to the family is placed above the safety or well-being of the individual. And so my father used this constantly in our home. Whenever he did something harmful, he would apologize, but then it would be followed up with something along the lines of, "Well, we're family, you have to forgive me." And for him, his expectation wasn't just forgiveness, it was also forgetting, pretending it never happened, and ensuring that we never revisited it ever again. And religion enforced this as well in our family. He often emphasized that he was the head of the household, which meant he had the final say in everything. And that meant that we were expected to obey him, respect him, and accept whatever he had to say, no matter how harmful it was to us as the individuals. Another quiet way families normalize harm is through minimization. And this is when harmful behavior is downplayed as if it wasn't that important or not that significant. Phrases like, it's not that bad, or you're overreacting, or, well, that's just how it is. And so when those messages get repeated time after time after time, they train children to question their own instincts about what was going on. And many adults who grew up in that behavior and in that environment often spend years thinking, well, maybe I did exaggerate what happened. Closely related to minimization is gaslighting. And so gaslighting happens when someone is actively denying or rewriting the reality to make another person doubt their own memory or perception of a situation. In gaslighting, things you might hear are, that never happened, or you're remembering it wrong, or you're too sensitive. When that happens repeatedly, children learn something very dangerous, which is that speaking up won't change anything. And so silence becomes that safer option for these children, which reinforces the original rule, which is don't talk. Another way families often normalize harm is by shifting blame onto the victim. My father didn't usually blame me directly for abuse and mistreatment. Instead, he blamed my mother. He would tell me that the reason he had affairs or the reason he did inappropriate things to me was because my mother apparently wasn't sexual enough. And years later, when my mother confronted him about hurting me as a child, he told her to her face that it was her fault. Why? Well, because she had allowed me to wear revealing clothing, or she wasn't available enough for him. That kind of blame shifting does something really insidious, and it keeps the abuser from being held accountable, and it can even potentially spread guilt across the entire family. Another dynamic that I saw growing up was harmful behavior being reframed as care or protection. So controlling behaviors like invading privacy or monitoring everything we did, severe punishments, even some stalking and other similar behaviors were often framed as, well, we're doing this because we love you and we want to protect you, or we just want what's best for you. And so when you grow up hearing this message, it can become really difficult to recognize controlling behavior later in life, because you've been taught that control equals to love and that it's not something to be feared. I remember hearing a really interesting story from an old teacher of mine that really stuck with me. So for context, during my senior year of high school, I attended a local college with a dual enrollment program so I could get college credits along with graduating high school. And years after I graduated, one of my teachers had heard about my father getting arrested, and we ended up chatting about it. And during that conversation, she shared something with me very interesting. She said that my mother once told her how concerned she was about Janae being so independent. And she told me she didn't really exactly remember why that came up. She says, I think it was like some kind of intro to the program class, but she remembered being really shocked by that comment. Now, keep in mind, this is a instructor who teaches high school students at a college and university setting. And so because of her experience and the folks in her classes, most parents of 17-year-olds are worried about the opposite program, a lack of independence and initiative, where they're saying, we need these kids to grow up. They're about to be adults. So my parents, on the other hand, were concerned that I was too independent. And she remembers thinking how this was so off, even though she couldn't explain why. And she didn't really have anything to maybe file a complaint about, but she remembered thinking, this is a very controlling behavior for a 17-year-old. Looking back, of course, it makes a lot of sense now. Independence threatens control. My father loved control, and he and my mother both strived really hard to control all of my actions. And in families where control is framed as love, independence, which is what I was trying to do in my latter high school years, can look like rebellion. I will say it was really nice to hear that perspective from someone externally on this topic. I remember feeling very heavily controlled, restricted, monitored growing up, and I had to fight my way out and to live on my own despite threats and coercion from my father, who really wanted me to stay there under his control. And knowing that someone else saw this and for what it was really validating, even years later. Another dynamic that showed up a lot in my childhood was what I would call intellectualizing the abuse. So my father often talked about how his brother had hurt him in different ways growing up. And he said that it created confusing feelings for him. And he used that as an explanation to justify his affairs with men and his trouble with violating people's physical and emotional boundaries. And he would talk to me about these things as if he wanted sympathy. And to be clear, people's trauma absolutely matters. It's very important to understand if we are responding in a certain way because of our own trauma. But when someone uses their trauma to justify harming someone else, it becomes just another way of the system protecting the abuser instead of protecting the victim. Another dynamic in many families is called enmeshment, which basically means there's weak boundaries between family members. So even when my mother realized that and acknowledged finally that my father had abused me, her instinct wasn't to hold him accountable. Her solution was to say, well, let's go to dinner and talk about it and make it all better, as if the solution to the abuse was simply a conversation to smooth things over. And so looking back, I do think that that response came from years of conditioning from him. In our family system, the priorities were always keep the peace and keep the family together no matter what. And so even if that actual problem never gets addressed and never gets fixed. Dysfunctional families often maintain balance by assigning roles to different family members. You've probably heard of some of them, things like the peacemaker or the scapegoat or the hero. And in my family, my brother James often became the scapegoat. He was growing up extremely volatile and violent, and he did eventually end up at juvenile hall at the age of 15 and never came home again. And while his behavior was absolutely unacceptable and needed intervention, it also absorbed a lot of that attention that might otherwise have been focused on the deeper dysfunction in the family, much of which was also contributing to his bad behavior. Another dynamic that many people recognize is parentification, and that is when children are forced to take on adult responsibilities. As I've talked about in other videos, I was heavily parentified growing up, and I often felt responsible for helping manage emotions in the household and help care for my younger siblings. And while children grow up in that role, they learn very quickly that their own needs become second to maintaining stability in the family. In addition, sometimes harmful patterns are reinforced through tradition, culture, or religion. In my family, the idea that the father was the unquestioned authority was deeply ingrained. If he said jump, we jumped. And we always knew that very clearly growing up, that our mother was extremely loyal to our father, not to us. And having later taken custody of my sisters and helped raise them myself, frankly, I can't ever imagine putting a partner over my children or people that depend on me. But that's what my childhood was like growing up. On a lighter note, there is a story that still makes me laugh and kind of roll my eyes to this day. When I was about 20 or 21 years old, I had already moved out, but I was still attending my parents' church so I could keep an eye on my siblings. And one Sunday, the pastor gave this very good sermon, actually, about dysfunctional families and the responsibility that parents have to make sure harmful behaviors don't get passed down generation through generation. So honestly, a surprisingly good sermon, and I am not a very religious person at all. But at the end of the service, my mother turned to me and said, completely seriously, "Do you think we're a dysfunctional family?" And me, and I'm pretty sure my brother as well, burst out laughing. And I was like, of course we are. Of course we're a dysfunctional family. Where have you been? And we had to sit there and explain to her why we thought that. Is our father was frequently hospitalized due to manic episodes. Our brother was in juvenile hall for his own behavior. Of course we were dysfunctional, and that's just two of the thousands of things wrong with our family growing up. But the way she asked that question, like it had never occurred to her before that we might be dysfunctional, really baffled me and kind of shocked me. But that's how normalization works. When you grow up inside a system or you're conditioned for decades within it, it can take a very long time to see clearly outside of those rules and normalization patterns. One of the hardest parts about healing from childhood trauma isn't just what happened. It's realizing that what you thought was normal was not. And family systems can normalize harm in many ways through silence, through loyalty, blame, through family roles and expectations. But once you start seeing those patterns clearly for what they are, something very powerful happens. You get to decide which patterns are going to stop with you and which ones you are going to refuse to pass on to the next generation. And with that last thought in mind, I just want to say thanks for being here. I'm Janae Cherie, and I hope that my stories help you to tell yours.